Hello, in this segment of the MOOC, we are going to be talking to Dr. Joe Ryan, a faculty member in the School of Social Work and a leading expert on child welfare and juvenile justice policies. He also co-directs the Child and Adolescent Data Lab, an applied policy and research center in the School of Social Work, aimed at addressing issues related to child welfare, foster care, and juvenile justice policies. We're really excited to have you today. Thank you for joining us. Great. So I thought that we could start off our discussion today by having you tell us a little bit about the issue of juvenile justice in the U.S., a little bit of history and a little bit of kind of the landscape of it as an issue.
Okay. So juvenile delinquency, I think it's important to start with, is totally normal for adolescents. If you think about your own development, your friends' development, maybe your kids, my kids, I have a high schooler now. It's normal to engage in risk-taking behaviors. Shoplifting, driving fast, curfew violations. These are total normal adolescent behaviors. So that's sort of a backdrop, a context, I think, of how we should think about the juvenile justice system and all the policies that are attached to the system. In terms of the scope of the problem, there's about 850 to 900,000 young people arrested every year, or at least in, let's say, last year, 2017. And that's about a 50 or 60% decline just in the last 10 years. So I think a lot of times in political rhetoric and campaigns, we think that crime is, an increasing problem, but it in fact is at a 20, 30-year low today. So that's sort of the scope of the problem. Most of the young adolescents are involved in things like property crimes, retail theft, fighting, things like that. And only a very small percent of adolescents are involved in violent crimes, less than 1% in terms of murder, robbery, aggravated assault. The juvenile justice system itself is about 120 years old. The first one was founded in Chicago, Cook County, in 1899. And it was this idea, essentially, that adolescents are less culpable than adults, and they are more amenable to rehabilitation than adults. And so that's really the foundation of the juvenile justice system.
Great. So one of the things, so you mentioned a little bit about the fact that even though crime is actually decreasing, there's a lot of political rhetoric around the system. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the discrepancy between the kind of increase in media coverage, or just the kind of pervasiveness of media coverage around the system, and the fact that actual crime is actually decreasing.
So I'm not an expert in that area, but I think that's just generally how our news cycles run. These negative sort of stories attract more eyeballs than, crime is decreasing type of story. The idea that, and it's not that there's not serious crime problems. You could look no closer than Chicago and homicide rates in the last couple of years, and those have been a real problem. But still, overall, these trends, and this is true for a lot of social problems we see: teen pregnancy, certainly juvenile crime. These are trends that we see improving over time.
Great. So, from your perspective, what are some of the current issues facing the juvenile justice system today in the U.S.? So
the primary issue, I think, for the history of the system for the last 120 years is what to do after an adolescent has committed a crime. Right? That's the biggest challenge. And so there's all sorts of innovations with regards to specialty courts. Should they go through the traditional juvenile court? Should they go through a mental health court if they have a mental health problem? Should they go through a substance abuse court if they have a substance abuse problem? Diversion, meaning diverting kids entirely from the juvenile justice system as an intervention. The use of secure confinement, right? So locking kids up in residential centers or detentions. Overrepresentation of African American and poor youth in juvenile justice. That's a long-standing and thorny problem for both the juvenile justice system and the adult correctional system. So I would say those are some of the big issues that systems are grappling with. Here in Michigan, they're also grappling with the age of who is eligible to be in the juvenile justice system.
So you mentioned about the differences in age by state. I'm wondering if you can give the viewers just some sense of the kind of general range that you're talking about when you're talking about juvenile justice system.
Sure. So the system's designed to work primarily with adolescents, children between 10 and 18 years old. That's generally what people think of when they think of the juvenile justice system. But in certain states, you could be younger than that. So here in Michigan, we treat 17-year-olds in the adult system. Okay. So where most states, if you were 17, if you were just across the border in a different state, you would be treated in the juvenile justice system. Here in Michigan, you're treated as an adult. Okay. And so there's real implications for then the treatment options that are available to you.
Sure. You mentioned talking about the disproportional kind of number of youth of color and low-income youth in the system, and I'm just wondering if you could, from your perspective, talk a little bit about maybe why you think that is. I know you talked about it being a thorny issue. But.
Sure. So this is a long-standing problem in child welfare, in juvenile justice, in adult corrections. And for the context of the juvenile justice system, I think you have to think of two things. The first is sort of what puts kids at risk of engaging in delinquency. And you could say poverty, limited employment opportunities for parents, underfinanced schools, high crime areas. And these risk factors really operate on all of us. The same things that make me inclined to engage in delinquency would make you inclined to engage in delinquency. The difference is we're not randomly exposed to these risk factors, right? So there's systematic processes in place that put African American and poor families at disproportionately high risks in terms of coming into contact with these risk factors. Then the second piece is, well, what happens once crime is observed or even observing crime? So whether there's greater surveillance in certain neighborhoods, and then even just the discretion with what to do with a particular delinquent offense. So we had some meetings with the local sheriff's office, and they were talking about very similar behaviors. Let's say it's a fight in a high school. It could be the exact same behaviors treated differently in one high school than they are in another, right? In one high school, let's say it's a predominantly white high school, they might treat it through the principal's office. And in another high school where maybe there's a resource officer or some law enforcement person stationed at that high school, it's a closer link to the juvenile justice system. So I think some of those things clearly impact, so discretion and just how crime is observed and treated.
So do you see policy solutions that could be put out that would help to ensure that there wouldn't be such discrepancy, or maybe some of these different kinds of court options that you mentioned?
Sure. So on the back end, certainly on the front end, you could talk about police discretion, who I interact with, and whether I bring them into the station or I just sort of warn them as a normal adolescent and don't continue with this. But on the back end, certainly once the process is rolling, there's some states that use things called sentencing grids that limit judicial discretion on what you can offer for a sentence. So it's essentially let's say it's a 5x5 table, and it's got the number of prior offenses I've committed and the type of offense I've just committed, and it'll give me a cell in terms of here's my disposition, here's the sentence that can be associated with this particular offense. So I think some strategies to limit discretion, both from law enforcement initial contact, and then both from and then at the time of disposition.
So I want to jump a little bit to the work that you're doing. So you are running the Child and Adolescent Data Lab, and I'm wondering if you could tell the viewers a little bit about the lab and the different ways that you're using data to help identify some innovative solutions or some policy directions.
Sure. So if you think about, first of all, how all of our systems are established, you have a child welfare system which handles child abuse, neglect, and foster care. You have a public education system which handles the education of children through high school. You have juvenile justice. And all of these agencies' systems operate independently. And when they do use data, which is quite limited to begin with, they only use sort of their data. So if you think about the juvenile justice system, and we're trying to figure out, how many kids are in the juvenile justice system. So that's often one of the most complicated questions, because no one in Michigan could tell you how many kids are on probation today. No one could tell you how many kids are locked in detention. And you essentially have a $630 million agency that runs with not much information in terms of policy and planning, data that can drive some of these decision makings. But so this idea that all these systems are operating in silos and on their own is a real problem, because if I'm trying to solve, let's take public education, for example. And, one of the things public schools and departments of education try to figure out is graduation disparities, right? Who's graduating? Why do we have graduation disparities? And by and large, they only use education data to do that. The types of classes kids have had, their age, race, things like that. But if you think about linking it with these other systems, were they involved in the juvenile justice system? Were they in the foster care system? Were they moving between multiple foster care homes? All these things, my experiences in one system have a big impact on my experiences in the other system. So if you think in the context of the juvenile justice system, if I'm on probation and my ability to get to court hearings and abide by my requirements for probation, it might be helpful to know if I'm bouncing around the foster care system. It might be helpful to know if my parents are incarcerated. And so we're developing data share agreements to link all of these state agency databases to see how vulnerable populations move through these systems, to see how their experiences in one system impact their experiences in another system, right? So that a policy that's implemented in what you would think is an allied system, like so when kids move between different foster homes, now they're mandated to stay in their same school. It used to be you would move from foster home to foster home, and you would move from school to school. So we would expect that this might have an impact on educational outcomes. So the idea that we are trying to bridge is develop partnerships with state agencies, recognize their expertise on the policy end, the boots on the ground, and then on our university side, on the data science, the data management, helping them think about a research agenda, helping them think about using information to guide policy and planning. That's the idea, building these partnerships with state agencies and universities.
It's interesting because one of the themes that has been coming across many of the interviews for the MOOC is the complexity of policy issues, and how we as a society have often created these kind of silo approaches to thinking about policy or to thinking about issues, when in fact they're so interconnected, and what happens in one realm impacts another, but our policy systems haven't always adjusted for that.
Yeah, and you could even say how we train students here in schools of social work, right? You could be a mental health student, you could be a child welfare student, as if these are not often the same families.
Right, exactly. So just in our remaining time, I'm wondering if you could, is there a particular project that the Data Lab is currently working on? I know you said that you're kind of working on getting some of these agreements in place. Have you been able to, kind of start to move one of them forward, and if there was any?
Yeah, so we have two sort of big projects. One is to look at the overlap between the child welfare, child protection system and the juvenile justice system. And it's this idea of helping states figure out how long they've actually been involved with some of these families. So if you think about the juvenile justice system, they generally see adolescents, 13, 14, 15, 16. Those are sort of the peak offending years. But when we map them on to all the child abuse and neglect reports for the state for the last 10 years, we see that on average, so about 60% of the delinquent population has a history in the child protection system. On average, they've been involved for about 8 years, and on average, they've had about 8 allegations of abuse and neglect associated with them. Wow. So the state's really been involved with a lot of these kids for a long time. And so really it's to sort of try to back it up a little bit and say, you know, what could we have done? Were there some turning points at which we could have been involved in different ways? Or what did we do with this set of kids that put them on a path that didn't lead to the juvenile justice system? And we're also linking it to the adult correctional system to see sort of, you could call it almost a life sentence in terms of involvement with state agencies. So we're trying to get a full scope, but so part of it is to back it up a little bit. So not just to look at this little window between 13 and 17 years old, but to say, wait a second, we've been involved for a really long time with a lot of these families on multiple occasions, right? And by and large, they are neglect. Neglect makes up 75% of the child welfare system. So these are poor families. And so to think about what are some opportunities early on that we could set in motion maybe different trajectories.
Have you seen either in the state of Michigan or in other states some innovative approaches to kind of address more early intervention? Like
not really, because no one's really linking the data. I mean, we just finished a report with colleagues in the Ford School mapping child abuse and neglect data with public school data. And it's about 18% of kids by 3rd grade have a formal investigation for abuse or neglect. I mean, it's a big chunk of the population. In some school districts, it's up to 60%. But no one's ever linked some of these data early on. So we've never had this understanding sort of how long have states been involved in the lives of these families. And so once we have that, then we can then go back to say, all right, well, what could we be doing at different points? And get input from these different systems, right? So this isn't just a juvenile justice problem because the kid happens to be 14. You know, it could also be a child welfare problem or a public education problem.
Do you think that there are things that are inherent in the way like state agencies or federal agencies are developed that make it really hard for them to collaborate? I'm thinking one of the things that sounds like you're suggesting is much more interconnection and collaboration across systems.
Well, I think, you know, there's territorial issues with just resources, right? But then, you know, then there's real questions about, well, what do you do once you know? So if I know that a particular adolescent is involved in the juvenile justice system, and I know that's going to have an impact on their trajectory through high school, middle school and high school, the question is, what do you do about that? And I think there's some legal and ethical considerations that we need to think about. You obviously don't want to tell a teacher that, you know, Joe Ryan's involved with the juvenile justice system. He's been involved for these different types of offenses, or he lives in a foster home, right? That's probably going to change the interaction that teacher has. But at the same time, not doing anything about it, not doing anything about the fact that you have a highly traumatized population in your public schools and it's going to interfere with their learning, you know, so I think there's certainly a lot of sort of considerations to make. The first is to figure out what's the scope of the problem. Do these things matter? You know, does my experience in the juvenile justice system have implications for my progression through the public school system? If it does, then we need to sort of come together as professionals across the space if it's in the best interest of the child.
Yeah, wow. Big issues, big important issues to be thinking about. So just in terms of advice that you might give, so many of the students who are watching this MOOC are potentially thinking about social work or definitely interested in social policy, and I'm just wondering from your vantage point if there's any advice you'd give for people that are thinking about linking social work and social policy.
Yeah, I would say get out there and work in the field. So get to know the families, get to know the children, that your policies, you know, I think sometimes we have these aspirations to be in think tanks and in university settings or in state government. But it's really important, I think, not only to get experience in the field to begin with, but to keep those connections when you ascend or descend, depending on where you put these policy folks. Get that experience and stay connected to the field because they have a direct impact on the families, they have a direct impact on the workers, and I think you'll become you'll essentially make better policy knowing those conditions.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time, and
Thanks for having me.
Thank you to all of you for watching.